Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. Resistance. October 25, 2004. The chants we do in the evening, before the meditation, are meant to put you in the right frame of mind to do the meditation, pointing out skillful ways of thinking. Whether we're contemplating the body, issues of aging, illness, death, and karma, thoughts of goodwill, reaction on the nature of the world. All of these thoughts are designed to remind you of how important it is to meditate. They also remind you of your motivation for meditation. Whether you're here to end something solid in the midst of the world, or as an expression of goodwill, it's useful to remember each time you sit down to meditate or do walking meditation why you're doing it, the importance of what you're doing, so that you do it with an attitude of proper respect and attention. In other words, you don't just go through the motions. You don't treat it casually. This is important work we're doing here, a point that's easy to forget. So we keep reminding ourselves, because thinking like this is an integral part of the meditation. People often believe that we're trying to learn how not to think, or trying to get the mind away from its conditioning, simply by stopping any language from going through the mind. But the Buddha's instructions on meditation involve a lot of thinking, training the mind to think in skillful ways. But unlike psychotherapy, which tries to trace your thoughts back to their origins, where they're coming from in time, he focuses on where they're going, where they lead. Do they lead you where you want to go? And he gives some recommendations on ways of thinking that really help you go in the right direction. As you carry through with his ways of thinking, part of your mind is going to rebel. For example, when you develop thoughts of goodwill, there may be a little voice in the back of the mind saying, "Well, I don't really feel goodwill for these people." Or, "I don't give a damn about where my thoughts are leading, I want to think about this." Don't assume that the purpose of these exercises in directed thinking is to smother up those other thoughts, or to pretend they don't exist. Actually, the purpose of the exercises is to dig the problems up, bring them out into the open. If the question of how you think about the beings in the world isn't brought up, you can sail merrily along with all sorts of mixed motives, all sorts of mixed attitudes, not really being aware of what you're doing, or of how your attitudes are coming out in your actions. Or if you have that apathetic feeling, "It doesn't really matter what I do, so I might as well just do what I like, it's good to know that it's there," then you can deal with it. So if you end these argumentative thoughts coming up in your mind, take note of the fact. Ask yourself, are you ready to dig into them? Are you strong enough? If you aren't, you can continue with the meditation, leaving them for the time being, but at least you know they're there. This is important. As Ajahn Lee once said, to practice is to learn about your dilemmas, the things that hide under the surface, and exert a lot of pressure and annoyance on your life, often without your knowing it. You're a lot better at knowing they're there, even if you can't quite deal with them yet. You're in a better position knowing they're there and that they'll have to be dealt with. Sometimes just bringing them to the surface is enough to make you realize that you don't want to identify with them. If apathy comes up, you look at it. Do you really want to side with it? Look at the lives of other people who are apathetic. Where do they go? Or if a voice in your mind has ill will for this or that group of people, is that a voice that you really want to identify with? Remember, you have the choice. We're not here to hammer out our genuine opinions about things, to reach a now judgment on them. We're here to see where thinking goes and how to use our thinking in skillful ways. This is part of the training. It's like training for a marathon. Once you've made up your mind to run the marathon, you've got to deal with the thoughts in the mind that resist. Some of them you can simply push out of the way as being ludicrous or totally out of line with your real aspirations. Others you have to sit down with and work through. But the fact that you've made an aspiration is important. If you've decided that this is an aspiration you really want to hold to, you owe it to yourself to work through all of your resistance, because so many of us go through our lives aimlessly, without any kind of aspiration at all. Here, as we're meditating, we've got a big one. Putting an end to sewering. As the Buddha points out, in the course of training the mind you've got to learn to deal with skillful and unskillful thoughts, skillful meaning those that lead in the direction of putting an end to sewering, unskillful ones, those leading in the other direction. At least you've made it clear to yourself where you want to go. That, in and of itself, is an important accomplishment. Even if you haven't devoted yourself 100% in that direction, it's important at least that the issue is raised. So many of us go through life without even thinking about where we're headed. We think about it a little bit here and there, but not in any concerted way, not in a way that makes us sit down and really look at our lives. For a lot of people, thinking about the general trajectory of their lives is pretty depressing, so they push the issue away. Big issues like aging, illness, and death get pushed to the corner until they can no longer be pushed. Then they come out at you with their eyes red and their fangs gleaming. You're not prepared to deal with them. Often they hit precisely when you're at your weakest point, on your back. If you haven't prepared for them, they come at you while you're down. Here, while you're meditating, at least, the issues are raised. You've got to ask yourself while you're healthy, while you're young enough, while you're still alive. What are you going to do to prepare for the time when aging, illness, and death and separation move in? And you're actually given a course of practice, something to train in, to help you out when those things happen. So, when you're given a practice, whether it's the precepts or the contemplations that the Buddha recommends, it's not that you're going into denial, pretending that you don't want to break a precept, or pretending that you don't harbor feelings of ill will. These contemplations are meant more to raise the issue. Do you really believe that your actions are important? Do you really believe that it's important to act skillfully? Do you believe that your thoughts are important, that it's important to think skillfully? Take some time to probe into those questions, because they're central to your life. And don't let yourself get sucked in by the media out there. They'd rather that you not ask those questions, that you lead a very short-sighted life, so you'll be content just to buy their things. So this is an act of resistance here. It's also an act of wisdom. When a particular reaction or contemplation brings up uncomfortable issues in the mind, realize that that's part of its purpose. To bring up those uncomfortable reactions, if they're there. If they're not there, you're nah. If they are there, you want to know. As I said, sometimes when they come up they just wither away in the light of your awareness. Other times you realize that they're like boulders that have been hidden under the water. The water has lowered a little bit, and now you see that there are boulders down there. You may not be in a position to dig them up, but at least you can avoid them for the time being, knowing that someday you're going to have to clear the channels. In the meantime, you're alerted that you have to work on your tools: mindfulness, concentration, discernment, so that eventually you can dig out those boulders. Then they'll no longer be in the way. Gladdening the mind. September 2, 2004. Gladdening the mind. This is an important skill in the meditation. The Buddha lists it as one of the basic steps in mindfulness of breathing. If your meditation gets dry, it starts to seize up like an engine without any lubricant. So you need to keep your mind lubricated, keep it refreshed as you're practicing. There are lots of different ways of doing this. Ajahn Lee gives the analogy of a parent who hears her child crying and knows when to take it out for some air, when to give it something to play with, when to feed it. In other words, you learn to read the cry and to look at what the child is doing, so that you can get an idea of what needs to be done to put the child back in a good mood. The mind is very much like a child. You have to look after its moods every now and then. One way is to drop the breath for a while and focus on some of the other recollections that the Buddha recommends. Recollection of the Buddha, recollection of the Dhamma, recollection of the Sangha. With recollection of the Buddha, you remind yourself that you're following a path set out by someone who was totally free of dilemma, who had no agendas, no ideas he was pushing just for the sake of satisfying or pleasing himself. He had found what worked and he taught it straightforwardly. Now, where are you going to end something like that anywhere else in the world? One of the reasons why deconstructionism is so prevalent in universities is because people often advance an idea because they want power over other people. They want to influence other people to act in ways that are pleasing to them. The purpose of deconstructionism is to see through those agendas. But in the Buddha's case, all he asked was that people practice the Dhamma in accordance with the Dhamma. On the night of his death, when the devas were singing songs, throwing down ores and incense in honor of him, he said, "This is not the way to pay homage to the Buddha. The way to pay homage is to practice the Dhamma in accordance with the Dhamma, which means practicing for the sake of dispassion, practicing for the sake of disenchantment with things, practicing for release. In other words, you show homage to the Buddha by gaining release from suffering for yourself." That's all he asked for. His was the most compassionate of motives. So when you're getting discouraged about the path, think about the other paths you might be following in life and realize there's nothing quite like this one. Even when you haven't yet reached the end of the path, it's still a good path to be on. And the same holds true for recollection of the Dhamma. Think of all the good things the Dhamma has you develop inside. Of course, being on the path means that they're not fully developed yet, but at least you're headed in the right direction, your trajectory is headed to the right place. The Buddha talks about the grief that comes from not having attained your goal on the path, but he said, look, it's a lot better than the grief that comes from not having sights or sounds or smells or tastes or tactile sensations that you like. He calls that householder grief. And where does that grief lead? It leads people to struggling and grabbing after things that are just going to slip through their fingers. Whereas the grief that comes from being on the path doesn't cause strife, and it leads in the right direction. Just that thought should inspire you to practice further on the path. The only problem is when the grief gets too heavy, the discouragement gets too heavy. That's when you need to gladden the mind by reacting on all the good things you've done as part of the path. And the path is asking you to do only good things, things you can be proud of, things that feel noble, honorable. You're not being asked to compromise your ideals when you practice the Dhamma. In fact, you're being asked to raise your ideals to a higher standard. Then there's recollection of the Sangha. When your mind feels full of dilemma, remind yourself that members of the noble Sangha have all been in the same place you are. And people of all kinds, men, women, children, rich people, poor people, educated, uneducated, healthy, sick, they've all been able to end within themselves the strengths needed to overcome the weaknesses within them. If you're having a long, dry stretch in your path, read some of the theory in Theragathas, where the monks and nuns tell of long dry stretches in their own practice, 30 years or more. And yet, eventually, they still gained awakening. So you can take encouragement from that. Then there's recollection of your generosity, of your virtue, all the good things you've done as you've been following the path. This is a valid recollection, a good one for gladdening the mind as well. As for recollection of the devas, this doesn't mean you sit thinking about devas. You think about qualities that make a person into a deva. The RST is the sense of shame you feel when you think of doing things that are beneath you, realizing that you're a better person than that. The second is fear of the consequences of unskillful actions, which means that you have a well-integrated sense of self, able to deny yourself immediate pleasure that's going to have long-term bad consequences for the sake of actions that may not be so pleasant right now, but are going to lead to good results on into the future. These are qualities that make people devas, and you have them within yourself. So that helps to gladden the mind. There's the story in the canon of a monk sitting in the forest on a holiday night. In the distance he can hear people playing music and having a good time, and he feels very discouraged. Here he is miserable, sitting out alone in the forest, and everybody else is having a good time. And a deva comes and says, "Look, there are lots of people who really envy you, because they see where you're headed, As for the people out there having a good time, their lives aren't headed anywhere. So when the path starts getting discouraging and the mind starts feeling dry, these are things you can think about to remind yourself that you're on a good path. It may be a long path, but it's a lot better than not being on a path at all, or on a path that requires compromises in terms of your ideals, in terms of your sense of what's right and honorable, and then yields a happiness that laughs in your face and runs away. Another good way to gladden the mind is with the breath. Finding ways to breathe that give a sense of ease, well-being, and refreshment both to the body and the mind here in the present moment. Don't be afraid of those feelings, thinking that they're an attachment. Of course you're going to be attached to them, but it's better to be attached to good things than to things that stir up the mind in harmful ways. In the beginning, these feelings of refreshment and rapture come and go seemingly without any pattern. But over time you begin to realize that they do have a pattern. When you get more and more familiar with them, you can tap into them more and more regularly. Another way of gladdening the mind with the breath is to explore different ways of breathing. Try to think of a way of breathing you never thought of before, and see what it does for the sense of the body. Think of the breath energy coming in, not from the outside, but welling up from within. Or breathing with different parts of the body. Breathing with your legs, breathing with your arms, breathing with your fingers. Notice which part of the body has been the neglected stepsister starved of breath energy, and focus on giving it as much breath energy and attention as you can. In other words, use your imagination. If you feel patterns of tension in the body, think of a big knife coming through to cut all the patterns of tension. In other words, use your imagination here not to wander away in fantasy worlds, but to explore some of the possibilities in the present moment. Try to think of some impossible ways of breathing and then try them, because you can learn a lot about your body that way. What's really possible and what's not. It's like reading about quantum physics. Some of the things they've noticed in their experiments, as far as they can tell, can be explained only by allowing for the idea that certain particles go backwards in time. That explanation required a real leap of the imagination. There's so much out there in the world that's counterintuitive. Your sense of the body here in the present moment has a lot of counterintuitive potentials as well. If you only go with your normal intuition, that's all you see. What you expect to see. See if you can surprise yourself with new ways of thinking about the breath. So there are lots of different ways of gladdening the mind. As Ajahn Lee said, it's like being a good parent. You need lots of different tricks up your sleeve. If the child cries and all you do is feed it every time it cries, you're going to end up with a fat, grumpy child. Sometimes the child has to go to the bathroom, sometimes it's just bored, sometimes it needs some fresh air. It needs a change of scenery. If all else fails, and nothing in the meditation seems to cheer you up, go out and walk around for a while. Find a little job to do. Notice some place in the monastery where it's not clean, where things are disorganized, and straighten them out. In other words, learn how to end pleasure in doing skillful things of every sort. Ajahn Fuang once said that when he was a young monk he used to avoid construction projects around a monastery. He'd help a little bit and then sneak away to meditate. Ajahn Lee never said anything about this until they were preparing for the Buddhist year 2500, and Ajahn Lee was going to hold a big celebration at Wat Asakaram. One day he said to Ajahn Fuang, "If you don't help me I'm going to die, you know." So Ajahn Fuang thought about it for a while, and now he said to himself, "Well, construction work in the monastery is a form of skillful activity. If I die with a hammer and saw in my hands, well, at least I was using the hammer and saw for good things." So be the sort of person who's always hunting for something skillful to do, because this lifetime is so short. If you spend your time just being depressed or discouraged, you waste so many opportunities for doing good. There's so much good that needs to be done in the world. Starting from little things, like keeping your surroundings clean and neat, and working on up. It's all worthwhile. There are so many ways you can gladden the mind. There's a story in one of Ajahn Lee's talks about an old woman who went to the monastery and noticed that the walking meditation paths weren't well swept. So she swept them and set out some water for washing feet. Just that much made her feel cheerful. It so happened that on her way home she had a heart attack and died. The next thing she knew, she was a diva, just from the cheerfulness that came from keeping the place around her clean. This story illustrates an important principle. Whatever you can do to gladden the mind in a wholesome and skillful way is part of your repertoire as a good meditator. Cherish your friends. March 12, 2005. Try to make the mind quiet. Try to make the body quiet. There are lots of levels to that quietness. One means sitting quietly, but, of course, the body isn't the only thing making noise and chattering away. The mind is too. And just as when you want to hear something very subtle, you have to sit very quietly, if you want to hear the subtle things going on in your mind, you have to make the mind quiet too. Focus it on the breath. Try to cut down on all the chatter. If you want to talk to yourself, talk about one thing. Talk about the breath. Ask yourself, is the breath coming in? Is it going out? When it comes in, how does it feel? Where do you notice it? When it goes out, how does it feel? Where do you notice it? Does it feel good? Does it not? If it doesn't feel good, you can recommend different ways of changing it. Try a little longer, try a little shorter, deeper, more shallow, faster, slower. Find a rhythm and texture of breathing that feels good for the body right now. If you're feeling tired, try to breathe in a way that gives you more energy. If you're feeling tense, try to breathe in a way that's more relaxing. You can talk about these things to yourself. That kind of chatter is not out of place in the meditation. It's called directed thought and evaluation, which are two of the basic factors for right concentration. But otherwise, try to keep the mind as quiet as possible because you want to notice what's going on. And, of course, what you're going to notice is that there are a lot of other ideas oating through the mind. Sometimes they don't just oat. They yell at you. They taunt you. They whisper to you. But you have the power of choice. You can choose which voices to listen to and which ones to put aside. You don't have to believe everything you think. You don't have to obey everything you think. So listen carefully to those voices. You'll begin to realize how much they push your life around. Some of them are well-meaning voices, some of them aren't. You don't know where you've picked up a lot of these ideas that you carry around inside. One of the functions of meditation is to give you a place to stand inside and listen very carefully, so that you can guru out where these things came from. More importantly, you can see where they lead. If you listen to certain thoughts, where are they going to take you? All too often, when a thought comes up in the mind, it's like someone driving up in a car. You're standing on the side of the road, someone drives up and says, "Hop in." And so you hop in without asking, where are you going? Who are you? If we lived our lives that way, we'd be dead by now. Someone would have driven us to a dark place, robbed us, shot us, and dumped our body out the back door of the car. But that's the normal way things are in the mind. Thoughts come in and you just go with them. So you've got to step back. Ask yourself, which thoughts really are my friends? Which ones aren't? In other words, which ones will to lead to your true happiness? Which ones won't? The chant we recited on friends just now applies both to friends outside and to friends inside. There are true friends, there are false friends. You've got to guru out which is which and to encourage the true friends. Notice that the Buddha said, attend to the true friends earnestly. In other words, when you guru out that someone really is a true friend, you want to encourage that person, cherish that person, because true friends are hard to come by. Years back when I was in Thailand, Ajahn Fuang gave me the job of teaching new monks after I had been a monk for 6 years. Every year we'd get a batch of temporary monks coming in, because that's the tradition there, for young men to ordain for about 3 or 4 months. There's a textbook for them to study during their period as monks. Toward the end of the book, as they're beginning to think about disrobing, there's a section on lay life. One of the teachings covers who's a true friend and who's a false friend, because this is a big issue in life. The book goes down the list, just as we chanted just now. People who befriend you to cheat you, those who adder and cajole, those who are your companions in ruinous fun. Those are false friends. As for true friends, the book says, those are the ones who are willing to die in your place. And every year the comment would come up. There are no true friends in the world. That's not really the case, of course. There are some. But you have to look really, really hard, asking, where is friendship with this person leading me? As the Buddha said, if you ND someone like that, cherish that person. We hear often that the Buddha teaches us non-attachment. Actually, he teaches non-clinging, which is a different sort of thing. Clinging is when you hold on to something and create suffering. That, he said, is something you should try to understand. Look for the cause and let go. But in the meantime, you've also got the path, and that's something you try to develop. It's something you hold on to as long as you need it. You develop virtue, concentration, discernment. These are your friends inside. And the same principle applies outside. If you have helpful friends, hold on to them, cherish them. And you try to be a good friend, a true friend, to that person too. So with regard to the question of holding on and letting go, the Buddha said you've got to be selective. There are 4 noble truths to life. It's not that you let go of them all. The truth, the suffering that comes with clinging, is something you want to try to comprehend. The cause of suffering, the craving that causes you to cling, is something you want to let go. Then there's the path, which you develop. To develop it, you've got to tend to it, you've got to cherish it, you've got to hold on to it. It's like holding on to the rungs of a ladder. If you try to climb up a ladder without holding on to the rungs, you fall. And even when you reach the roof, or as Ajahn Suwat said, even when you're nished with the path, as far as you are concerned you don't need the path anymore, but you think of the people who will come behind you, and of how easy it is for weeds to grow on the path, how easy it is for the path to get obliterated, so you still tend to it for their sake. The same way with true friends. If they've helped you, it's not that you leave them behind. You show them gratitude because that's one of the most important lessons you can give to other people. It reminds them that there's something good in life, something that really should be valued, because it's so rare. That's friendship on the outside. As for friendship on the inside, you want to be friends with your wise qualities inside, the thoughts that help you, that point you in the right direction. You want to learn how to encourage them. After all, meditation is not simply a matter of driving thoughts out of the mind. You have to learn how to think skillfully. Just listen to all the conversations going on in the mind. Should I meditate? Should I not meditate? Notice all the voices that say, no, I'm too tired, I need my rest, I want to do something else. Ask yourself, are those your true friends? Where are they going to take you? Learn how to encourage the voices that take you where you really want to go. This is one of the most basic skills in meditation. If you can't master this one, you can't do anything else basic, like sticking with the breath. For some of us, this is easy. We've had parents who encouraged us and we've learned how to listen to those voices of encouragement. If your parents didn't encourage you, you have to learn how to train yourself to encourage yourself. This is part of what they call emotional intelligence. Years back there was an Olympic swimmer, Matt Biondi, I think was his name. He was expected to sweep all the medals in the swimming events, but he blew the RST event. All the commentators said, that's it. He's probably all shaken up. He's going to go down into a tailspin. But his coach said, don't ride him. He's not that kind of person. And sure enough, he won all the remaining events because even though he could have easily gotten discouraged after the RST event, he knew how to talk to himself, to encourage himself, so that he didn't give up. He kept his spirits up and kept performing at his best. That's what we've got to do as meditators. Learn how to talk to yourself so you can stay on the path. When things are going well, how do you talk to yourself so that you don't get careless? When things are not going well, how do you talk to yourself to give yourself encouragement, to get yourself over those dry patches? That's a basic skill in the meditation. Learning who your true friends are inside your mind and learning how to encourage them. The Buddha once said that friendship with good people is the whole of the practice. On the external level, that means staying with people who can teach you the practice, because without them, how would you know what to do? On your own, could you think up the path that the Buddha found? Would you have the stamina to stick with it? The example of other people who have trod the path is what keeps you going. On the internal level, friendship with good people means your ability to gauge out who inside your head is your friend and to cherish that friend, encourage it, listen to it. That ability, more than anything else, is what keeps you on course. Your inner mob. September 6, 2005. The mind is like a town meeting. Lots of people, lots of different opinions. Sometimes the town meeting is well run, people are reasonable, courteous, but often it goes out of control. People start shouting, and a kind of mob psychology takes over. If you're standing outside the mob, it's easy enough to see that the people are crazy, but if you get down in a mob with enough people who believe, say, that somebody's a witch, you can end up setting her on. And then after it's all over you say, gee, how did that happen? It's the same with the mind. Every now and then some crazy idea comes and takes hold of every voice in the mind, and the only way you cannot get swept up in the craziness is to step outside. Unfortunately, there's no little compartment in your head outside of your brain where you can go to escape the voices. You're in there with them. But there is an aspect of your awareness that's separate from these voices, and it is a really important skill in the meditation. There are states of mind that the Buddha called hindrances which can come sweeping through the mind. The problem with each of them: sensual desire, ill will, torpor and lethargy, restlessness and anxiety, or uncertainty, is that it blinds you. You start seeing things in line with the hindrance, and you lose sight of what's genuinely for your own true being. In other words, when sensual desire comes along, the object really is attractive, and you can't stand not pursuing it. When ill will comes along, the person that you don't like is really a bad person. That's how it seems. When sleepiness comes, you can talk yourself into falling asleep, taking an extra nap, waking up and turning over and falling back to sleep again, because the body really needs sleep at a time like that. And so on down the list. And yet after the hindrance has passed, you look back on it and realize that you didn't really have to follow through with it. You could have done perfectly well not following the object of your lust or desire. You could have done perfectly well without doing anything nasty to the person that you don't like. It's just that, at the time, your perceptions were skewed. The Buddha compares each of the hindrances to a different kind of water. Sensual desire is water with dye in it. Say there's red dye in the water. The things in the water look red, but when you take them out, they're not. It was just the dye in the water. Ill will is like boiling water. If you try to look down into boiling water, you can't see anything clearly because of the turbulence. Torpor and lethargy are like water led with algae. Restlessness and anxiety are water ruined by the wind. Uncertainty is like water in the dark. Even though the water may be clear by its nature, it's not in a situation where you can see anything in it. When the mind is seized by these hindrances, you can't really see things for what they are. So you've got to learn how to recognize the hindrances when they come and realize that you don't want to get involved with them. If you can catch them in time, in their very early stages, you can realize, this is a hindrance. This is nothing to get involved with. You can separate yourself out. This is one of the basic skills that you need, not only as a meditator, but also to survive in life. When I visited Ajahn Suwat that last time, he'd had some brain damage in his automobile accident. He mentioned that he had the mindfulness to know when his brain wasn't functioning right. He said that his brain was giving him all sorts of weird perceptions. But because he'd been a good meditator, he had developed the mindfulness not to fall in with them. This was very different from my father, who developed Parkinson's dementia as he got older. He'd see big animals in the house and people committing suicide out in the yard, all kinds of disturbing things. You'd try to talk him into realizing that they were all illusions, but he wouldn't believe you. If there was a black dog in the living room, there was a black dog in the living room, no matter what evidence you could show that there wasn't. This is the difference between a mind that's trained and a mind that's not. So you have to nip these things in the bud. Otherwise a mob psychology takes over in the mind, and it's not just voices screaming in your head, but also changes in your body. The blood starts racing faster, the heart's racing faster, different feelings of tension and pressure arise in different parts of the body. When you're angry, there's a weird feeling in your gut. And because there are the physical symptoms, you say, gee, this must be what I really feel. But that's not the case. It's just your hormones running amok. A hormone gets into your blood, and it keeps circulating around in your body, even after the particular mind state is gone. You've gotten used to the idea that if you've been angry and the physical symptoms of anger are still in the body, then you must still be angry. That makes room for the thought of anger to come back in and take over again. So one thing to remind yourself of is, it's just the hormones in the blood, and the actual thought of anger comes and goes. It's the same with all the other hindrances. Just because there's a physical symptom doesn't mean that the emotion is especially real. It's like people presenting arguments. I've been reading through a critique of the Monk's Rules book right now, and the person writing the critique has some strong arguments, as well as some weak ones. The strong arguments are the ones where he simply points out, this is a mistranslation, and that's it. When the arguments are weak, that's when he starts getting belligerent, throwing in a lot of emotion. This is the way the mind works. When a particular dilemma knows that it has a weak case, it shouts and it screams, and it uses every trick it can think of in order to push you into following it. So when things come on that strong, learn to recognize them just as the hype of the dilemmas, in the same way that you learn to see through the hype in an advertisement. If all else fails, just hunker down, for sometimes when these things come on really strong, they've got to run their course. All you can do is make up your mind that you're not going to fall in line with them, you're not going to act under their power, and you just hunker down with the breath. Don't get involved in the conversations. Don't get pulled into a shouting match. It's like that storm we had several years back, with 100-mile-per-hour winds. There was nothing you could do except stay in your tent or your hut and wait for the storm to pass. In the morning, when the winds had died down, you could come out, survey the damage, and gure out what needed to be done, but while the wind was blowing, it was hard to gure out anything at all. So when these strong emotions come blowing through the mind, just try to keep yourself separate. Hunker down. Ajahn Lee has a good way of viewing these things. He says, you don't know who's actually speaking in your mind. You've got all those little germs in your blood. Maybe the thoughts in your mind are the thoughts of the little germs passing through your brain. Or you may have seen cases of people actually possessed by a spirit. Maybe this is a spirit coming and trying to possess your mind. In other words, learn how not to identify with these crazy voices. Ask yourself, if you actually followed through with that particular voice, where would it take you? And if you start getting crazy answers to that question, you realize it's impossible to have a conversation here. Just hunker down. Wait for the storm to pass. Wait for the craziness of the mob psychology to run its course, but the important thing is that you don't become part of the mob. If you can gain this kind of perspective on your thoughts, you can save yourself a lot of grief. As that bumper sticker says, don't believe everything you think. Don't identify with everything that's coming through your mind. Don't fall for the hype of the dilemmas pressing their case. When these things get really strong, just hold on to the breath for dear life. When the storm is past, you'll be glad that you didn't allow yourself to get swept away. Mindstorms. December 1, 2004. There's a part of the mind that's just aware. No matter what else comes into the mind, greed, anger, delusion, despair, depression, regret, or fear. It's just part of the mind. There's also another part that's just aware of these things, but it tends to get blocked out when strong emotions come in. Still, it's always there, like the hum of the refrigerator always there in the background. Or maybe a better analogy would be the hum of the Big Bang, The deep be it that's still detectable from all directions all the time. One of the tricks of the meditation is learning to get in touch with that part of the mind, not to regard it as something exotic, but to have it as the background state of mind, the basis of your conscious awareness. This requires a shift of your center of gravity, because for the most part, we tend to live in our emotions, in our creations, in the little worlds we create for ourselves. But as the Buddha pointed out, there's a lot of soaring in those worlds. They all require ear to keep them going. They have to feed of something. When the Buddha says that becoming is conditioned by clinging, the word clinging can also mean feeding or the act of taking sustenance. And the sustenance is the passion of desire, the desire that makes us create these worlds, that pulls us into these worlds, and impels us to take them as far as they can go. There's always an act of feeding going on, and it's stressful. So you've got to learn how to get out of those little worlds you've created for yourself. Otherwise you can create huge emotional storms that can blow you away. People talk about sitting and meditating and being blown away to the point where they can't even sit anymore. But if you actually look at the wind from the outside, there's no physical wind blowing them over the seat. It's just that they let these emotional storms get blown up in the mind, and they put themselves in the storms, so of course they're going to get blown around. What's important to remember is that there's always an awareness surrounding the storms. If you can place your center of gravity in that awareness, you don't get blown away. It's not that difficult to get out of the storms if you can observe them as they arise, as they're just beginning, but they're hard to extract yourself from if they're already full-blown. So you need to learn how to change your center of gravity in advance and keep it changed. Otherwise the secondary storms, the ones that blow in on the tail of the RST storm, can catch you off guard. One of the problems is the impatience that blows up as a separate storm. You get impatient. When are these storms going to go away? And then you place yourself in that second storm, the impatient storm, and that can blow you away as well. Or you can get swept up in a storm of boredom. A lot of these secondary storms are the ones that throw meditators off balance, so you have to watch out for them. Remember that there's a space around those storms as well. You have to learn how to watch those from the outside, too. A great deal of the commentary going on in the mind is just this sort of thing. You pull yourself out of the storms whirling around events from the past or future, but then you let yourself get caught up in storms of the present. When these things come up, regret or impatience or whatever, just watch them. They may seem awfully powerful and awfully real, but you can learn to question their reality. Remember that although there may be a reality to these things, it's a created reality, false, artificial. It's something you're creating right now, and you may not even be aware of what you're doing. Back when I was younger, I used to like to write Ktyon. Basically what a Ktyon writer does is to inhabit a little mental world, exploring what it feels like from inside. The more real you can make that world to yourself, the better the story when you write it down. What's uncanny about these worlds is that sometimes a character you create can surprise you. The more real the character becomes in your mind, the more it can start doing unexpected things. When that happens, you start thinking, maybe this character has its own reality, but it's actually augmented your own imagination. The reason these characters can surprise you is the same reason that you get surprised by things coming into the mind in normal world creating thoughts. You're so oblivious to what you're doing that it can actually surprise you. That's when these thoughts begin to seem very real, to have an independent existence. What's happened, though, is that the part of your mind creating them is behind a wall, separated from the part that's watching them. That's why they can take unexpected turns. This is why we have to get the mind really, really quiet, both, so that we can get closer and closer to the part of the mind that simply observes, and to get clearer about where these fabrications are coming from. When you can see that second part in operation, it offers no surprises. And when you get to the point where fabrications offer no surprises, you start getting disenchanted with them. You see them for all their artificiality. You can begin to pull yourself out of their worlds more and more consistently. So whatever storms come brewing up in the mind, remember, It's just an event in your awareness, and there's an awareness surrounding it, outside of the storm. Learn how to give more weight to that awareness than to the storms. If you're going to identify with anything, and it's natural that we do identify with things all along the path, learn how to identify with that very still awareness. It may not seem very intelligent, very creative, but it's your salvation. It's what you can hold on to that'll keep you from getting blown away. How many times have you seen people who are very clever, very imaginative, very creative, and then something takes on an independent life in their minds, and they can actually end up killing themselves, simply because of their thought creations? They end themselves pushed into all sorts of weird and self-destructive behavior, simply because they can't let go of particular thought worlds in their minds. So for the survival of all that's good and worthwhile in your own mind, you've got to learn how to step out of these things, realizing that although that simple awareness may not seem interesting or clever, it's your real friend. And there's a wisdom in learning how to stay there and watch, not to be impatient to get results, not to be impatient to see how things turn out. Learn how to be more stable in that watching, because the stability is what will allow you to see very subtle things, to see the tricks the mind plays on itself, the places where it pulls the curtain down, or throws up walls to maintain its illusions. Your steady gaze is what's going to enable you to see through those illusions. In the early stages of the meditation, that basic watcher, the observer, may seem as unstable and as fragile as any of the other worlds you might create. But as you get more and more used to placing your center of gravity here, you end that it's a lot easier to stay here than to keep creating those other worlds. This awareness, too, is a kind of world, and there will come a point where you have to take it apart, but in the meantime, this is the most stable world at your disposal. Over time, your center of gravity can begin to shift more and more in this direction. Once it's here, the qualities of stability and patience and endurance come a lot easier, and you come to value them more. Although they themselves may not seem all that surprising or entertaining, they do allow you to end out some very surprising things about the mind. In particular, you learn how to see through this process of creation. Where do these worlds come from? This is how the Buddha discovered dependent co-arising, by just watching very patiently, putting himself in a position where he didn't get blown away. It's like really good scholarship. Everyone wants to get in on the dialogue of common scholarly assumptions and show that, yes, they can engage in that dialogue as well. But the people who say, well, stop. Wait a minute. These questions don't make sense. Something's wrong here. Those are the ones who bring a real advance in knowledge. When you step back to get out of a particular dialogue, you begin to see its underlying assumptions for what they are. The same thing goes on in the mind. There are little signals and signs that the mind sends to itself, and you feel clever in catching their meaning. Yes, I understand that signal, I understand that sign, I'll play along with that. And then you get sucked into the world of those signals and signs. But it takes real understanding not to get sucked in by the signals, to step out of the worlds that those signals create. Ajahn Suwat once said that one of his greatest insights in meditation was seeing how the mind liked to play make-believe with itself. You have these little internal signals and agreements, well, this is this, and that's that. And suddenly there's a whole world of becoming, just because you thought you were clever in interpreting and catching on to the signs. So sometimes it's good to play dumb, to say, I don't understand this doesn't make sense. And step back. That right there is a lot of the practice. 79. The story behind impatience. November 20, 2005. Back when I was in college, I majored in history. One of the big frustrations about majoring in history was that you felt you could never really get to see what it was really like back in the days you were studying about. Studying about the 13th century, what was it really like? Think about all the generalizations they make about 13th century culture in Europe, and yet having lived through the 20th and into the 21st centuries, what kind of generalizations would you say really do justice to the reality of that kind of experience? How can you sum up a century in a sentence or two? The more you read the stories that make up history, the more you realize they can never take you back there. It's good to react on this, because look at how we live our lives. We tend to live in the narratives that we make about things, what happened in the past, what we would like to see happen in the future, what's the basic storyline, looking for development, looking for closure. How much does that storyline really have to do with reality? How much does it actually stand in the way of our seeing reality? Think about that, especially as you meditate. There are ways of telling the story of your life that help get you into the meditation. For example, you can look at your past suffering, recognizing that a lot of it was caused by your own unskillful habits, and come to the conclusion that your skillful habits need some work. That kind of story helps bring you into the meditation. But there are a lot of other stories that pull you away. You've got to watch out for those, because they make you impatient. They make you less observant about what's actually going on. You sit here working with your breath. Maybe in the back of the mind there's the thought, let's just get this over and done with so we can move on to the next stages, which are a lot more interesting. So you're not really looking at your breath. You're looking at your plans for the next stage. You're thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow or what's going to happen the day after that. You're looking at your thoughts about how much longer you're going to have to be stuck with this until you get results. That's the kind of story that gets in the way of actually seeing what's happening right here and now. So when you see those thoughts arising, learn how to put them away. This can be hard because a lot of our sense of who we are is in the story. This is an area where the teaching on not self is useful. To see how artificial and made up our sense of who we are is, and how it gets in the way of the work we need to do in the present moment. People sometimes believe that the whole purpose of the meditation is to get into the present moment and just stay there. The Buddha never talked like that. He always said, there's work to be done in the present moment. That's why you get here. You want to settle down here with the purpose of understanding the intentions acting here in the present moment, because that's the only place where you can really observe your intentions in action. If there's any greed, anger, or delusion in the intention, you're going to see it only in the present moment. After it's passed, that intention is just a memory, and you know how memory tends to color things depending on what you want to see, how it ties into a good or bad narrative about yourself. But it's just a narrative. There's no guarantee that it's going to get you to the reality of the intention. The only way you can really see is by looking in the present moment. And when the present moment is full of distractions, don't think of the process of dealing with your distractions as getting in the way of where you want to go. If you see it simply as getting in the way, you're going to overlook it and try to push through it blindly. Instead, see it as, this is the spot where the awakening is going to happen, where the understanding is going to happen, and through the process of watching the breath, catching the mind as it wanders and bringing it back, that's where all the insights are going to arise. In other words, the problems in the present are not something you simply want to push your way through or get out of the way. They're something you want to look into, because the Buddha had an amazing insight about the present. You may have heard the story that, after the night of his awakening, he spent 49 days experiencing the bliss of release. Not only bliss, he learned an awful lot in the course of those 49 days. You may also know the story of when he was in the forest of samsapa trees. Samsapa trees have tiny leaves, about the size of a dime. And he scooped up a handful of them from the forest door and asked the monks, which is more, the leaves in my hand or the leaves in the forest? The monks replied, of course, the leaves in the forest are many more than the leaves in your hand. And the Buddha said, in the same way, what I learned in the course of my awakening is like the leaves in the forest. What I have brought out to teach is like the leaves in my hand. And he focused on the Four Noble Truths as being the leaves in his hand. There are other passages where he boiled down the basic insight he gained in his awakening even further. It's a simple principle of causality. When you think of all the amazing things he could have talked about, it's interesting that this is the one he found most worthwhile to teach. His insight was basically that our experience is based on two kinds of causal patterns. One is that when X exists, Y exists with it, when X ceases, Y does too. In other words, these things come and go together. This is causality happening right in the present moment. The other principle is that from the arising of X comes the arising of Y, from the passing away of X comes the passing away of Y. This connection doesn't have to happen immediately in the present moment. It can occur over time. When you put these two principles together, they mean that any moment of experience is the combination of three things: the cause arising in the present, plus the effects of that cause, and effects coming in from the past. And what is that cause? Your present intention. And where are the effects from the past coming from? Past intentions. This means we have free will. Our intentions shape our life. At any moment we can choose what to focus on, what to do, what to say, what to think. We're not compelled by the past. There are nuances coming in from the past, but we can choose which nuances we're going to let pass, which ones we're going to work on, which ones we're going to pick up, and what we're going to do with them. That's what the whole fabric of our experience of time and space comes from. The constant input coming from intention. And the Buddha's insight was that if you look at where the new input is coming from, you'll see the way out. And where are you going to see that new input? Right here, right at the intentions in the present moment. You really want to get to know these well. The best way to get to know your intentions is to set up one intention to see how long you can keep it going, and to see what other intentions are going to come in and try to change it. Then you learn the skills needed to maintain that original intention, as long as it was a good one. Here the intention is to stay with the breath, and to think about the breath, to evaluate the breath, to make it more comfortable, so that you can stay here longer, to give more support to your original intention. As you get more and more sensitive to the breath, that you also get more and more sensitive to those intentions. Those are the real causal factors in your life. What's dismaying about them, especially in the beginning of the practice, is to see how random they are. This little intention and goes in one direction, and then another one comes and goes in the exact opposite direction, or other ones come from all over the place. But don't let yourself get discouraged when you see this. Learn the skills you need to focus on a skillful intention and stay there in the midst of all this randomness. The randomness helps remind you how artificial your storyline is. Storylines, if they're going to maintain your interest, have to have a clean trajectory. There may be a few setbacks here and there to make the story interesting, but eventually there's one overall trajectory. It's like the basic shape of a melody. It may be an arc. It may be a valley between two peaks. And the individual notes may play around with that, go outside of the basic arc a bit, but there's a basic shape to what we hear. That's what makes the melody satisfying. When we're creating a narrative out of our lives, we're trying to string together only the intentions that make sense, that seem to tee into a basic shape, but when you meditate, look at what you've got here. Intentions running all over the place. That's an important insight right there. Even though it's the dismaying insight that comes from seeing how unconcentrated your mind is, it's a valuable insight. If you take it to heart and use it skillfully, it'll help deconstruct any narratives that are getting in the way of your practice. This way you'll find it easier to settle down with less and less distraction. When you can let go of the narratives, there's really a lot here to discover. Whether the meditation goes well or not, whether it goes in line with your expectations or not, that's just another narrative. The important thing is that you really look at what's right here, right now, particularly with regard to your intentions. You have your intention to stay with the breath, and, whoops, there's another intention going someplace else. Bring your focus back to the breath. You've learned something about the mind right there. The act of bringing it back strengthens your original intention, strengthens your resolve, and the fact that you're able to catch the mind as it's wandering strengthens your mindfulness and alertness. So whether things are progressing at the rate you'd like to see in your ideal narrative, that's not the point. The point is that you're looking and you're learning. Sometimes you may have more lessons to learn than you originally thought, but if you don't start from where you are, Where are you going to start from? If the picture of what your mind is doing in the present moment doesn't tie into your ideal narrative, maybe it's time to question the narrative and not get impatient with the present moment. Because what is impatience? Impatience is the part of the narrative that makes us judgmental in an unskillful way. We need our powers of judgment, but what turns powers of judgment, a being judicious, into being judgmental is that we get impatient. We want to come to a decision really quickly before all the evidence is in, and as a result the judgment is useless. One more obstacle in the way of seeing things as they actually are. So give the present moment some space. Don't push it too hard, thinking you've got to get this or that result in this or that amount of time. Really. Look at what's going on here without impatience, without the narrative that gives the push to impatience. That's when you'll get to see what's interesting and unplanned, because the spot where intention enters into the causal pattern, the route by which it enters in, is also the route by which you're going to get out. And it's right here. It's not in the past, it's not in the future, it's right here. Allow yourself to settle down right here, and that way you'll get to see it, to know it, and to follow it to release. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.